Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Undone Season 2. In this video I will give my review for the show Undone, particularly its second season. Now, I have mentioned this show on my channel before, mainly in I did like top 10 shows of the year for season 1, made my top 10, I believe it was in my top 5. And there was a couple other videos where I mentioned the show, but I've yet to do a singular video just for this show. So I'm going to start this video off as spoiler free. So if you have not seen the show at all, this first section of the video will be safe for you and sort of give you an idea of what the show is about. But then in the later part of the video, I'm going to get more specific about Season 2, in which case I do have to get into spoilers, but I will give a spoiler warning before I do that. Now, so Undone is an animated show, although you could say it's like rotoscope, because they film it live action but then animate it afterwards, kind of like the film Waking Life and In the Scanner Darkly do. It stars Rosa Salazar, who was most well known for Alita Battle Angel, yeah, it's about time travel. So it's co-created by Raphael Bob Waxberg, the creator of BoJack Horseman, but I believe the showrunners, actually I believe her name is Kate Perry, who also worked with Kate Purdy, who also worked with Raphael Waxberg on the later seasons of BoJack Horseman, and so they conceived of this show. In fact, if you're a BoJack Horseman fan, they talked about how the season 4 episode Time's Arrow, which featured a psychedelic trip through time through the lens of someone with Alzheimer's disease, so she could only remember certain parts, that episode was kind of a warm-up for this show that they were starting to create at this time, which didn't actually come out till several years later because animation takes a long time. Now, Undone Season 1, I really loved. I was quite fond of it. It featured Bob Odenkirk as playing the deceased father of the main character, Alma, played by Rosa Salazar, who had died, but he appears to her from the afterlife and tells her that she has the ability to time travel, and he urges her to go into the past and find out who had murdered him and perhaps travel back in time and stop it. So it's a very interesting premise. Now, the one thing I will say before getting into spoilers is that a lot of people felt that Season 1 was self-contained, and I disagreed. And I tend to, actually. There's a lot of times where a show comes out with the season and a lot of people are like, oh, this is self-contained, where I'm like, no, I think we do need a Season 2. Russian Doll is another example I'm thinking of, and then also the show Watchmen, and the show End of the Fucking World. I've heard all those people say, oh, it just needed one season, but I was like, no, we can do another one. But then, of course, there are other examples of shows where I do think should have just had one season, 13 Reasons Why being the chief among them, that shouldn't have had more seasons. But most of the time, I champion having more seasons, and Undone was definitely an example of that. And I will say that Season 2 is just as good, if not better, than Season 1. So I do feel vindicated that I don't think Season 1 was self-contained, and they in fact found a way to keep the story going, and in fact in some ways I think they made it even better. They learned off of their experience from Season 1 and did an even better job in many ways with Season 2. So I think, yeah. So I'm not sure if I would say season 2 is better than season 1, but I would definitely say it is at least just as good. And I think this is an incredibly underrated show, which is why I'm doing a spoiler-free section, because I'm sure a lot of people haven't seen it. So if I did full spoilers for the whole video, then probably no one would watch the video. So if you haven't seen Undone, definitely go watch it. If you've seen Undone season 1 but are iffy about if a season 2 would work, let me tell you, it works. Go watch it. Season 2 was actually, quite amazing. I will say that. And it's funny because I mentioned Russian Doll, and I made the comparison to the show before because this show originally came out several months after Russian Doll, and so people would compare the two because they both feature an eccentric, quirky female lead who is... They're actually kind of similar in the way that they're sarcastic and witty and fast speed. And, of course, they both deal with time travel or time manipulation in some way. And so I could see the comparisons being made. Now, Russian Doll got more of the attention and more of the accolades, to be fair. Most people would prefer Season 1 of Russian Doll to Season 1 of Undone. The few had actually seen Undone. But I disagreed. I actually said that I preferred Undone to Russian Doll. Now, and it's also similar in regards to most people thought that Season 1 of Russian Doll was self-contained. But Season 2 of Russian Doll was released pretty much the same month as Season 2 is Undone. So that similarity is continuing. However, and I will be doing my own separate review for Russian Doll in a few weeks, but I will just say here, without any spoilers of course, that Russian Doll Season 2 actually failed to live up to the quality of Season 1 of Russian Doll. So now in this way it's totally different from Undone, whereas Undone succeeded with the Season 2, and Season 2 was a success and just as great as Season 1, whereas Russian Doll kind of failed. And it's Season 2. Those who are saying, oh, it should have only had one season, are now looking a bit more right than me, because Season 2, while not completely terrible, definitely was a huge step down in quality from Season 1. So if you've seen Season 1 of both these shows, but haven't seen Season 2 of both these shows, I would prioritize watching Undone Season 2, because that was a success. Where Russian Doll Season 2, a lot to be desired. And so in this way, Undone overall, I think, is definitely more a better show and a greater success than Russian Doll. But I still love Season 1 of Russian Doll. But as I said, I will cover that in a more detail in another video. Anyway, so my rating for Undone Season 2 out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. Definitely check it out. Almost a 10, but the season finale I had a lot of issues with, which is a shame because the rest of the season was amazing. But the season finale, I didn't think totally sucked, but was a bit disappointing, and I think went in a different direction that I didn't really want the show to go in. But so that's why I just downgraded it from a 10 to a 9. But it still gets a 9. It's still an amazing season of television. I would say that the show does stand out as one of the better shows I've ever seen. So it is a show I will think that is very memorable. So if you haven't seen it, please do yourself a huge favor, especially if you like time travel, especially if you like mind-bending shows, you like quirky, character-driven stories with quirky, witty characters, then go, please. And especially if you're a fan of BoJack Horseman, absolutely go watch this show. So now is the time where I get into spoilers. So if you haven't seen Undone Season 2 up to the very end. You will not want to continue onward until such a time that you have. So, spoilers will begin now. So, what impressed me the most, because I remember having this conversation with my sister because I recommended this show to her after I saw it, and she said that she hated the finale of season 1 because they implied that this was all in her head, which is strange because I actually didn't get that from the finale, but when I went back and watched, I could see her point. But for me, I felt more like they were implying an ambiguity to it, like they were trying to be ambiguous of whether or not it was actual time travel or just her being crazy. And I kind of dismissed that, though, as, yeah, they can be ambiguous all they want. As far as I'm concerned, it is straight out time travel. So you can imagine that I was completely delighted when this season began with right out the bat confirming, now this is actually time travel. Like, this is totally time travel. And more than that, like, it confirmed that her attempt to bring her father back to life was successful, and it in fact changed the timeline, which surprised me because I thought very clearly that season 1 was implying that attempt did not work, and she couldn't bring her father back to life, and it was not going to happen. But right out the bat, it does. And in fact, that's kind of the entire premise of season 2, is that she's in an alternate timeline now where her father was alive the whole time. She's got a different relationship with her sister. She's not like so depressed and doesn't have the mental issues, and she's better off in her life. She's like this great student or whatever, and her family's happier, and she has a better relationship with her sister. And then we start to find that her sister also has time travel abilities. And I love that. I was so happy. I thought that was such an interesting way to take it, because I really thought that they would further this impression that she couldn't really time travel, or that people didn't think she could time travel. And I honestly thought Bob Odenkirk wouldn't be in this season very much, because the trailers, and I'm so impressed, and I gotta give a lot of praise to the trailers, because the trailers did a lot to hide this. Because Bob Odenkirk barely appears in the trailers for season 2. In fact, they just have one line of his audio to imply, oh, he's around or something. But most of and I love how the trailers kept it hidden that this is in fact like a whole different timeline where she's happy. And I think that's most trailers, especially since the very first episode, and like at the start of the episode, right away they tell you that her father's back to life and that this is a different timeline. So most shows, most movies, information like that is revealed immediately, the trailers would tell you. The trailers would give it away, because they're like, wow, you're going to find out as soon as you watch the show anyway, so we might as well advertise this and get people excited. But they didn't fall into that trap. They still found other ways to try to entice people to watch the show, to make the trailers look interesting without giving away that very vital, like the entire premise of the season. And I so impressed that they managed to do that. And so the premise starts out where it's this very happy family, and so you gotta think, well, if everyone's happy and everything's great, where's the drama in that? Where's the storytelling? But of course we find out that even though things are better than her other timeline, everything is not great. Everything is not copacetic. And then the more the season goes on, the more you realize that everything's starting to fall apart anyway. And I love the reveal because at the very start, her father is telling her, oh, you're much happier now. You're a student. You're working on your thesis and all this. You should just forget about time travel and stop trying to rock the boat and just focus on this. Focus on your thesis. But then as the season goes on, she starts to realize that this other version of her, because apparently it's really interesting, when she changed the timeline, she kind of merged with the other person, so it kind of became a new person. Like the version of her in the old timeline merged with the alternate version, which I think is a very interesting concept. I don't have any issues with that. But as the season went on, she's starting to realize and remember, because she remembers more about that other timeline, that no, the other version of her was not happy. She was still displeased, even though on the surface it seemed like her life was better. She didn't have the outward mental issues. Her father was alive. She wasn't in as much conflict with her mother or her sister, but there was this undercurrent of tension and unhappiness that no one in their family was acknowledging, but it was there. I love that. I think that is absolutely brilliant storytelling. And of course, as the season goes on, we get more of what is the cause of that, and has more to do with her mother than her father. So the season where season 1 was all about rescuing and fixing her father, season 2 is about rescuing and fixing her mother. And I love that. I love that change of direction. And I actually find it interesting getting this different version of Elma, who is like as I said, like a merger of the both timelines. And so she's outwardly more happy, yet she still has that level of discontent that was much more to the surface in, season 1 timeline, but it was completely buried in that alternate timeline. But when they merged, that undercurrent that was buried came more to the surface. And then, of course, getting the scenes with her bonding with her sister, I think this was a really interesting dynamic. It was a much more interesting dynamic. It really kept the story fresh. It didn't feel like they were treading the same ground as season 1 was treading, but yet it was just as interesting still. Where she had a different relationship with her sister, and the fact that her sister could time travel, in fact, her abilities seemed to be more attuned, particularly to what they were trying to accomplish, than hers were, yet her sister was very more hesitant to use them, and so she became this sort of bad influence, constantly pressuring her to use them. And then Bob Odenkirk's character, father, was really hesitant and was against using it because he does not want to upset what he felt was the perfect timeline. It's definitely the better timeline because he's alive. But in the original timeline, he had, messed things up and killed himself and someone else because he let his obsession get the better of him. So in this timeline, he learned to completely let things go, which he thought was the better thing because it kept the family happy. But as it turns out, Elma is still like pushing them to use their time traveling abilities, and it turns out that going completely the opposite direction and completely ignoring their time traveling abilities, which also lead into ignoring what happened to Bob Odenkirk's mother, which also becomes a very important storyline this season, is not actually the right thing to do. That you got to have like a mixture of it. And then we get the whole storyline of who's Alejandro, because we find this mysterious figure in Elma's mother's life named Alejandro. And of course, at first they think it's that it's an ex-lover or a mistress, so to say, that their mother was having an affair on their father, which seemed the most likely possibility. But then, of course, we find out that is not entirely true. That her mother did have an affair with someone, but it was before. Um, it was before her father met her, so she was never cheating on him, but she had had a son with this person uh, prior to meeting her father. Uh, and so, yeah. um, and when I saw it's animated, so it was hard to tell. But when I saw the priest guy that apparently had that affair with Alma's mother, I was like, "Hey, that looks like Rios from Picard," and it is. It's the same actor who played Rios in Picard, and I don't really want to think about that show right now. But he's a good actor. You know, his choice of shows notwithstanding. But anyway, so so they find out that that they had this forbidden affair, and that he left her to become a priest, and was unaware of the fact that he got her pregnant because she kept this hidden, and then she went and gave the son up to this orphanage, and then met Bob Odenkirk's character Jacob, and moved to America, and then had Elma and Becca. And she always kept the fact that she had this son hidden from her family, because she thought it would destroy the family. Now, when she was first pregnant with Elma, she went to Jacob, Bob Odenkirk's character, went to Jacob's mother, and who was still in a mental institution at this stage, and apparently they had built up quite a relationship, and she asked her for advice on what to do, and she flat out said, "Do not tell him." Now, this ended up being a huge mistake, because it led to Alejandra feeling abandoned by her, because she had went back to Mexico with the intention of adopting him, but decided not to, and she introduced herself to him, but kind of refused to be in his life, refused to introduce him to her family. And her family was, especially when Alma and Becca find out, they're like, "Why did she do this? She should have just told us from the start." And I actually thought it was a really touching scene, a really great scene, when Alma and Becca met Alejandro for the first time, because they're like, "Hey, we're your sisters," and they're being their whole quirky selves. And they were really okay with this, but then Alejandro, he got upset with his mother for when he found out that what she had done, that she completely abandoned him when she had the opportunity to adopt. And so then it becomes a story of Alma and Becca trying to time travel back to Jacob's mother's past. So we go even further back in time to, I believe, she was it was Hungary, where she was from, where her parents were like mystics. So it feeds into their whole their family has this time traveling and future seeing ability, and that this was embraced when she was a child, but then the corrupt police were gonna arrest them and kill them because of this. And that she had managed to escape as a daughter, but she had, as a child, but she had blamed herself for her parents' death, and that's why she had buried this, and it eventually led her into giving that advice to Camilla, Emma's mother, to abandon Alejandro. And so they travel back in time to try to fix this. And then Jacob, of course, at first was he was very anti-time travel, and he was very against it, but eventually Alma did convince him to go along with them, but then he became obsessed with trying to save his mother, to the point where they heavily implied this directly led to his death a year later. But he even at that point he said he regretted nothing. But yeah, it was a very interesting turn for the story that he became absolutely obsessed to the point where he was almost he was putting himself in danger. In fact, putting the whole timeline in danger, because if he changed the timeline so that she had died or never left Hungary, then none of them would be born. And so they're risking all their whole existence. And so I felt the stakes in that. This felt like very good, like time travel, very high stakes, like better than Back to the Future, at least as far as this time travel stakes go. I would say, but eventually, they get it to work, and they get her to realize, without altering the timeline too much, that they get her to make peace with herself. And it was actually a very beautiful scene where we see all the different versions of Alma's grandmother kind of coming together. And I love how the show's so great, because I love how it explores the heritage of someone with mixed heritage, because season 1 did get a lot into her Native American heritage and her Mexican heritage, and they went more into that in this season as well. But I also love how they also explored more of her father's side of the heritage of her European heritage as well, and how that a lot of her time travel abilities came from that as well. I loved it. I thought it was brilliant. And to also bring up Russian Doll again, where again this seems like, comparing the two, this is like the much better version, because Russian Doll also dealt with the main character going to Europe and exploring her heritage, but it was so boring and it really didn't work. Where here, this was much more poignant and made much more sense and was much more powerful. So now let me get into that finale, because I mentioned that I had some issues with it. And here's the thing. You know how I said that season 1 ended kind of ambiguously, with season 2 right off the bat said, no, it's not ambiguous, it's just all about time travel. Well, the finale of season 2 kind of brings it back to, well, maybe it could be ambiguous. It brings it back to that being ambiguous again. Although, again, just my reaction to this is the same as my reaction to season 1, is that I don't care what anyone says, it's definitely time travel. Now, I think it's less ambiguous than season 1, but there is definitely a path where and I think they did this on purpose for the people who didn't want there to be time travel, there's definitely a path that you could rationalize that all this time travel stuff didn't exist. Because you could say that the entire events of season 2 was a vision or dream or a delusion that happened all inside of Alma's head, and that in fact she had never fixed the timeline, and there was never an altered timeline, that she was actually just there the whole time, and she had this vision that allowed her to make peace with herself and realize that she needed to change her ways. Because of course, which is not what the story itself tells you, but you could definitely rationalize that and have that interpretation if you so desired. I do not so desire, but if you do, I think they left that open. If you want to have that interpretation, you very well can. But because she decides to, even after she made peace with everything, she fixed everything, and then of course Jacob ends up dying anyway, but he dies in more of a peaceful, he's more at peace with himself, he was at peace with his family, and so and he lived a lot longer too, so it's a much better death. And I had no problem with that aspect of it. I thought that was still very powerful. And of course, because they changed the timeline, of course, once again, where Alejandro was raised from the very beginning, that she, instead of hiding it from Jacob like Jacob's mother suggested, she told him, and they both went down and adopted Alejandro as a 5-year-old. So there was yet another timeline change where Alejandro was with them and raised as their brother from the very beginning. and so it was a much happier ending. But of course, by changing this, it leads to Jacob's death. But he is okay with it because he'd made things better, and it is a very touching ending. But then I think they kind of ruined it by having that Elma decide, and this is apparently the door that they were hinting at throughout the season, that she needed to go back to the original timeline because there's a version of herself that is really fucked up and empty and like thrown in the mental institution and doesn't get along with her family, and that she needs to go back and become that person again in order to bring like the wisdom of what she'd learned through her experience back to that person. Now, either you can interpret as I said, you could interpret that as that was all just the vision of it happened. There was none of that stuff with Alejandro or anything ever happened. It was all just the original timeline to begin with. Or you could say this is time travel and she went back to her other universe, to her other self. Now here's the issue I have. Of course, I don't like the first interpretation because this is definitely time travel, no doubt. Problem is, if you look at it from a time travel perspective, they are conflating their time travel logic. And this is what bad time travel movies like Looper will do, is that there's certain different schools of thought on time travel logic, and it doesn't matter which one you choose as long as you pick one and stick with it. A lot of time travel shows or movies that have really wonky time travel logic, like there was that one with Ryan Reynolds that came out really recently. Their problem is they don't stick with one, they conflate them, and you can't do that. And unfortunately, I think that's what this finale does. If you look at it as a perspective that she's not insane, that this isn't just a vision, that this is actual time travel, then they're conflating their time travel logics. Because, and again, I use this YouTube channel, this guy Lore Runner, I use his terms. I don't know if he made them up or not, but 3 types of time travel logic. Type 1 is whatever happened, that you can't change the past. If you go back to the past and do something, it was always meant to be that way. Type 2 is there is a singular timeline where if you go back and you change something, the future is altered, and so in order to restore the future to what it was, you have to go back and fix whatever it was that altered. And then there's type 3 time travel, which was lesser used, but it's becoming more prominent now with like the Marvel Universe and Star Trek 2009, is the mini worlds theory, that if you go back in time, you change something, you create another parallel universe or another timeline. So both timelines exist side by side, and so you could so you can't like fix the timeline because you now have 2 different universes where the one you came from is still there, but the one that you altered and changed is also there, so they both exist. The problem that I have with this is that it conflates type 2 and type 3 time travel, because throughout the show this has been type 2 time travel, and they made that very clear. That actually makes sense for the start of this season, because she had changed the timeline so that her father never died, and so now the timeline's different. So that other timeline that she came from is gone, it doesn't exist anymore, and that's why her consciousness goes and merges with that other self, because that timeline doesn't exist anymore. But at the end, they reveal now that timeline actually does exist, and it's still there, and there's a different version of herself still off there being depressed. Then why did that version of herself merge with the other version? Like, that makes no sense. I don't get that. I suppose you could come up with some wonky logic. Well, because she used her time travel abilities and she existed outside of time, therefore she got to merge with that other universe she created instead of returning to her original one. But to me, that's not good enough excuse. That this still conflates, because from what I understood from the way it was developed, from the way it was being shown, this is type 2 time travel, that there is only one timeline, and if you change it, it is changed. And so now at the end, they're all of a sudden saying, no, this is type 3 timelines. There are many worlds. So is there another timeline where her mother's unhappy and never got to be with Alejandro? And then there's the first time, and now there's a timeline where she is with Alejandro, and Becca and Alma were raised with him the whole time, but the other one, when they weren't raised together, still exists. And yet there's another one out there where Jacob was dead from the very beginning of the car crash. Like, that's too confusing. That's kind of fucking things up. So I didn't like the ending where she went back to the original timeline. Like, in theory, like, if you look at it as like a character story, yeah, it makes sense. It works because she learned from her experience and she wants to give this to this other version of herself. But when you look at the time travel logic of it all, there shouldn't be another version of herself. This should be the only timeline. But whatever. But, you know, as I said, I already gave my rating for this in my spoiler-free section. And as I said, even though I didn't like the finale, it didn't ruin the whole season for me. It knocked it from a 10 to a 9, because I do think this season would have been a 10 if it had a better ending, because it was an amazing season. And although that ending does knock it down a rating, it doesn't totally ruin it for me. It doesn't make the entire season invalid. It's still a great season, because even though they fucked up with their time travel logic in the finale, it was what made this season so great was the character stories. And just like season 1, I fucking love the character of Alma. I love Rosa Salazar's performance. I've seen her in some other things, and honestly, she's not as good in other things as she is in this show. Like, she's absolutely amazing in this show, and I just love this character. I love the quirkiness, and that's another thing that Russian Doll was not able to maintain into season 2. Their characters were not as interesting. The character Nadia was not as fun and interesting as she was in season 1. The supporting characters became more annoying and less quirky than they were in season 1. But this show, Undone, kept the strengths of the character stories, and in fact enhanced it. Like, Becca was a more interesting character this season, and Alma was just as interesting. Camilla was more interesting. They fleshed her out more and made her less annoying. Jacob was just as interesting. So they either maintained or improved it, and they introduced more interesting characters like Alejandro, who did an amazing job of fleshing out this character. So that's why, even though they fucked up with the time travel logic in the finale, that's why I still say this is an excellent, amazing season, because it's about the character stories, and that they totally succeeded. Even in that time travel logic fuck up, it's still a good character story. It's still a great resolution for the character of Alma. And they either maintained or improved the characters, whereas Russian Doll kind of failed. The characters were nowhere near as interesting as they were in season 1, which is why this season 2 Undone was much better, much greater success than season 2 of Russian Doll, which was a bit of a failure. But as I said, like, I can't help but mention that show because they're so similar, especially they come out together. But as I said, I will cover Russian Doll more in another video. So, you already have my rating, 9 out of 10. Absolutely amazing season. As I said, if it wasn't for that finale time travel logic fail, it would be a 10. But it's still a great season. I will remember this as one of the best seasons of television, honestly. So that is it for my review of Undone. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please check out my channel as I cover many other shows. I'm covering a lot of Star Trek at the moment, covering Star Trek Strange New Worlds, covering Better Call Saul, which is coming out, and I'm covering many more shows on my channel like Star Wars Rebels, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks so much for watching.